She spoke in French, assuming the saleswoman wouldn't understand. She thought she was humiliating a simple woman, one who knew nothing of the world. But what that saleswoman held within her was something no money could buy. When she opened her mouth and replied, word for word, without a single mistake, the air in the store stilled. And that moment was just the beginning. Diane arrived at the store on an ordinary Monday, with a worn backpack slung over her shoulder and a smile that asked no one for permission. The store was one of the most famous in Santon. Imported clothes, expensive perfumes, lighting that made everything seem gilded. A place where people entered to be seen as much as to buy, and where employees quickly learned an unwritten rule. The more discreet your presence, the better. Diane learned this on her first day, only she interpreted the rule in her own way. While other employees worried about appearing elegant, she worried about understanding the store's flow, which pieces sat unsold, which clients returned, which returned dissatisfied. In her first week, without saying a word to anyone, she rearranged the accessories section in an almost imperceptible way. Only those who knew the space well would notice the difference. But sales in that section went up. The manager, Claudia, couldn't explain why, nor did she ask. Diane didn't have the kind of beauty that stopped a store. She was a 2-year-old woman, hair tied back, nails short, not a single piece of jewelry on her body. Next to the other saleswomen, made up, perfumed, trained to allure with their appearance, she seemed almost out of place. Her colleagues noticed this, and some made sure to point it out. "Which store did you come from before this one?" asked Rodrigo, the team's longest-serving salesman, during their break on the third day. "Outside," she simply replied. "But outside where?" "Outside the country," she clarified, picking up her coffee. Rodrigo gave a short, awkward laugh. He thought it was a joke. Diane didn't bother to explain. What no one knew, and she was in no hurry to tell, was that her worn backpack had crossed airports on 3 continents, that those unadorned hands had signed reports read by executives in Paris, that her carefully neutral accent concealed years lived far from here. She was in that store for a reason, but it wasn't yet time to reveal it. One afternoon in her second week, while folding a pile of imported scarves, she paused, looked at the main display window, stood silent for a few seconds, as if calculating something. Then, she took a small, black-covered notebook from her pocket and jotted something down. "What is it?" Fernanda asked the colleague next to her. "Nothing," Diane said. "Just an observation." Fernanda looked at the display window and saw nothing wrong. She shrugged and returned to work. The note read, "Main display window oriented towards wrong traffic. Premium product invisible to those entering. Estimated visibility loss, 40%. No one read it. No one asked. The notebook went back into her pocket. That's how Diane operated. She observed before speaking, accumulated before acting, having learned the hard way that showing competence too early, in the wrong place, to the wrong people, could cost a lot. So she waited. And while she waited, she attended to customers with an attention most sales associates no longer possessed. She listened to what they said, and she listened to what they didn't say. She noticed when a woman walked in looking for approval, not clothes. She noticed when a mother was buying for her daughter and needed kindness, not sales arguments. The clients she attended to returned. Claudia, the manager, noticed this, but instead of praising her, she frowned. There was something about this new employee that she couldn't quite place. She wasn't a bad employee, but she didn't fit the store's mold. And managers like Claudia, in stores like that, preferred pattern to talent. On a Thursday afternoon, the store door opened with that specific lightness of someone accustomed to doors opening for them. Diane looked up, and something in her face changed for just a second, imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. The woman had entered with a firm step, but her gaze swept across the shelves without stopping at anything. It wasn't the look of someone searching for an item, it was the look of someone searching for a person. A wedding ring spun on her finger, 2 turns, 3, without her noticing. The security guard at the entrance received a gaze so brief and so empty it seemed to erase the man from the spot. And the handbag she carried, the kind that costs enough to buy a used car, was closed with a crooked clasp, a small detail that escapes notice when someone leaves home with their mind elsewhere. She hadn't come to buy anything. Diane knew exactly who that woman was, and she knew, with the clarity of someone who had seen this type of situation before, that the afternoon was about to get much more complicated. Vera Montero didn't just walk into places, she arrived. There was a subtle difference, and anyone who had worked with people of her caliber knew how to recognize it. It wasn't just the clothes that cost more than any employee's monthly salary there. It wasn't the perfume that arrived before her. It was the posture, the unshakable certainty that the space around her belonged to her by natural right. She was 48, with dark, impeccably styled hair and a smile that functioned as a warning. When Vera smiled, it was time to prepare. She was the wife of Eduardo Montero, owner of a business group with operations across 4 provinces, but those who knew her understood that the title of wife was too small for what she truly was. Vera co-managed the family's image, chose who her husband appeared with in public, decided which events merited their presence and which did not. She had brought down partnerships, ended contracts, and dismissed employees, all with elegance, all with a smile, never raising her voice. It was more efficient that way. She walked through the store like someone conducting an inspection, touched a few items without real interest, looked at the saleswomen with that specific gaze, the one that assesses and dismisses in less than 3 seconds. When her eyes landed on Diane, they stayed there a second longer than expected. Claudia, the manager, appeared almost instantly, as if summoned by some invisible signal. "Mrs. Montero, what a pleasure." The tone was one of speaking to someone truly important. "May I help you personally today?" "No need, Claudia." Vera didn't even look at her, continuing to observe Diane. "Let this one attend to me." Diane approached calmly, unhurriedly, without that forced smile most saleswomen plastered on their faces when a wealthy client appeared. "Good afternoon," she said. "May I assist you?" Vera didn't answer immediately. She picked up a scarf from the shelf, examined it, then carelessly returned it. "This type of item," she said slowly, "requires a trained eye to recommend. Do you have experience with high-end fashion?" It was a question that didn't expect a real answer. It was the beginning of a game. Diane knew the game. "I do," she replied without elaborating. Vera raised an eyebrow. She was accustomed to longer, more nervous answers. The test escalated slowly, as it always did. First, there were indirect comments about the pieces, comparisons with European brands she knew most saleswomen wouldn't be familiar with. Diane knew them all, responding with precision, without arrogance, without trying to impress. This bothered Vera more than any mistake would have. So she changed strategy, beginning to speak in French. It wasn't sudden. It was a calculated transition. First a word here, another there, as if it were natural. Then complete sentences directed at Diane, loud enough for the other saleswomen to hear. The tone was of someone laughing at a joke only she understood. She said the saleswoman had the look of someone who had never left the city. She said certain people are born to serve and will never understand the world of those who are served. She said it was a pity that true talent was so rare in this type of work. In the middle of one of her sentences, she turned her face slightly to Claudia, a quick, almost imperceptible glance that said, "See?" Claudia immediately averted her eyes. Vera turned back to Diane with a small smile on her lips, the kind that doesn't need teeth to hurt. Rodrigo, on the other side of the store, pretended not to listen. Fernanda looked at the floor. Claudia smiled awkwardly, without intervening. Diane stood still, let Vera finish, and then replied in refined, precise French, without hesitation. She not only understood every word but corrected, with the most disarming naturalness in the world, an expression Vera had used slightly incorrectly. She explained what the more appropriate term would be and added, with the same calm as someone discussing the weather, "But I understand that sometimes informality has its charm." The air in the store stilled. Rodrigo looked up. Fernanda slowly exhaled. Claudia's mouth hung slightly open. Vera didn't back down. She wasn't the type to retreat, but something crossed her face, quick, almost imperceptible. It wasn't shame, it was recognition. She had found someone who didn't fit where they were, and for Vera, that wasn't admirable. It was a threat. She smiled her usual smile, polite, controlled, empty. "Interesting," she said in English. "Very interesting." She left the store a few minutes later, without buying anything, and when she reached her car, she pulled out her phone. She had a number to call, and a decision made. The next morning, Claudia arrived at the store earlier than usual. Diane noticed this. She also noticed that the manager avoided looking at her. She answered in monosyllables. She had that specific attention of someone who had received a bad instruction and hadn't yet decided how to execute it. The day was strangely silent. Colleagues who normally exchanged a few words with Diane during breaks kept their distance. Rodrigo passed her twice without greeting her. Fernanda deviated her path to avoid passing through the section where Diane was. Diane didn't need much to understand what was happening. Vera had called. What she didn't know was exactly what had been said and to whom, besides Claudia. But she knew this kind of move. She had seen it before. The person with power calls, plants a doubt, suggests a problem that doesn't exist, and lets the environment do the rest. No one needs proof. Suspicion is enough. At the end of the afternoon, Claudia called Diane into her office. The room was small, with a glass table and 2 chairs. It smelled of stale coffee. Claudia remained standing, which already said a lot. "Diane, I need to be frank with you." "You may," Diane said, sitting down. "I received some comments about your service yesterday." Claudia chose her words carefully, like someone walking on ground that might crack. "Comments from an important client who found your tone inappropriate." "Inappropriate in what way?" "That you were defiant. That you created a bad atmosphere." Diane remained silent for a few seconds. "I understand," she said. "And do you agree with that assessment?" Claudia didn't answer immediately, and that pause was the most honest response she gave during the entire conversation. "What I can tell you is that this client has a very close relationship with people who matter to this store, and such situations need to be avoided." "Situations like responding in French?" Claudia frowned. "Isn't it?" "Then what is it?" The manager closed the folder she held, even though she hadn't opened it. "I'll need you to sign a formal incident report. It's protocol." Diane looked at her for a moment, then signed without contesting, placed the pen carefully on the table, stood up, and left. The next day, 2 of the clients she had attended to the previous week returned to the store and specifically asked for her. Claudia noted this in silence and said nothing, but the process had already begun. Diane knew that night, instead of going straight home, she stayed at her kitchen table with the black-covered notebook open in front of her. She spent 2 hours organizing everything she had observed in recent weeks. The cash flow that didn't match the volume of customers, the supplier contracts with below-market conditions, the poorly positioned display window, the premium products stuck due to lack of proper exposure. It wasn't a rant. It was a document. She wrote with the precision of someone who had done this before, numbers, estimates, comparisons with industry standards. Each observation had a basis. Each suggestion had a logic. When she finished, she read everything once, made 2 adjustments, and closed the notebook. Then, she stared at it for a long time. Delivering that was a gamble. It could be ignored. It could be used against her. It might not reach the right hands. And if it reached the right hands at the wrong time, it could accelerate exactly what she was trying to avoid. But not delivering it was also a choice. And that choice had a cost she wasn't willing to pay. The next morning, Diane arrived at the store with the document inside a simple envelope, no name on the front. She asked the receptionist to deliver it personally to Mr. Eduardo Monteiro, not to his assistant, not to his secretary, but to him. The receptionist looked at the envelope, then at Diane. "He doesn't come here often." "I know," Diane said, "but when he does, deliver it." She returned to her post, tidied her section, attended to 3 clients, smiled when she needed to smile, and waited. 2 days later, when she arrived at work, there was a letter on Claudia's desk. Diane didn't read it, but she saw the logo in the corner. It was from the Montero Group. Claudia called her into the office at 10 a.m. with an expression Diane hadn't seen on her before. It wasn't anger, it was discomfort. "Your situation here," the manager said, choosing each word, "may be changing soon." Diane left the office without knowing what that sentence meant. Your situation here may be changing soon. It could be dismissal. It could be something else. Claudia hadn't given anything more, no tone, no direction, no deadline. And that ambiguity, Diane knew, was sometimes worse than a bad answer, because the mind fills the silence with the worst possible scenario. She returned to the floor, arranged the scarf section that was already arranged, folded what was already folded. She needed something to do with her hands while her mind organized itself. That afternoon, Vera appeared again. It wasn't shopping hours. She brought no companion. She walked in, moved slowly through the store, greeted Claudia with 2 lingering air kisses, the kind of greeting that is a display of power, not affection. Then she let her eyes wander through the salon until they found Diane. When they met, she smiled. It was the smile of someone who had already won. Diane didn't avert her gaze, didn't smile back, continued what she was doing with her usual calm, but inside, something tightened. Vera stayed for about 20 minutes, bought nothing, talked to Claudia in a low voice near the counter. Before leaving, she passed by the section where Diane was and said without stopping, almost as if talking to herself, "Some people confuse competence with insolence. It's a shame." She left without waiting for a response. Rodrigo was on the other side of the shelf and heard everything. He said nothing, but took a step back, as if to make it clear he had nothing to do with it. Diane took a deep breath, put away the fold she had in her hand, and went to the restroom. She stood for 2 minutes in front of the mirror. She didn't cry. That wasn't it. It was just the kind of pause the body requests when pressure accumulates. She returned to the floor. The next morning, she arrived at work and found her drawer rummaged through. Nothing was missing, at least nothing she could prove. But the organization was different. Someone had tampered with it. The black-covered notebook wasn't there. She had never left it in the drawer. But she realized whoever rummaged expected to find it. At 11 a.m., Claudia called her again. This time, there was another person in the room, an HR woman Diane had never seen, with a thin folder on the table and a pen in her hand. "Diane, we'll need to formalize a few things." The HR woman opened the folder, but before the dismissal contract, there was another document, an internal incident report. It stated that an item of significant value had disappeared from stock that week, and that, according to employee reports, Diane had been seen near the restricted area outside regular hours. Diane read slowly, line by line. "This didn't happen," she said calmly. "It's an investigation process," replied the HR woman in the neutral tone of someone who doesn't want to know the truth, only to follow protocol. "While it lasts, we'll need you to sign an acknowledgement form and remain restricted to the common areas of the store, without access to the premium section until the investigation is concluded." Diane looked at Claudia. The manager didn't meet her gaze. Diane read slowly, unhurriedly, from beginning to end. It was a letter of termination, dated for that week, with the justification, inadequacy for the job profile, and reports of conduct incompatible with company values. She read it a second time, then placed the paper on the table. "May I take a copy?" "Of course," said the HR woman, with that neutral tone of someone executing decisions they didn't make. Diane took the copy, folded it carefully, put it in her bag, thanked them, which clearly disconcerted the two across the table, and left into the main salon. Fernanda looked at her with that expression of someone who both knows and doesn't know. Rodrigo studied the ceiling. 2 clients who had arrived shortly before waited for assistance. Diane went to them. She attended to both with attention, with care, with the same time as always. One of the clients bought 3 items. The other left with Diane's name noted in her phone, saying she would return. Claudia observed all this from the office door, without saying anything. At the end of her shift, Diane organized the section one last time. She folded pieces that were slightly crooked, repositioned 2 products that had moved, small gestures that no one had asked for, and that no one would notice. Then she slowly took off her badge, ran her finger along the metal edge, and carefully left it on the counter. She went to get her backpack. It was at that moment that the receptionist approached with a slightly different expression than usual. It wasn't urgency, but it was something. "I have a call for you." She paused. "From Mr. Eduardo." Diane stood still for a second. "You can transfer it," she said with a firm voice. She walked to the fixed phone in the corner of the store, the same corner where 3 weeks earlier she had made her first note in her notebook. She picked up the receiver. "Diane," said the voice on the other end, direct, without unnecessary introduction. "I received your document. I read it carefully. I have some questions." She waited. "Can you meet me early tomorrow?" "Not here at the store." "I can," she replied. 7:30 a.m. I'll send the address." The call ended abruptly, without circumlocution, without promise of anything. Diane slowly replaced the receiver. She remained for a moment with her hand still on it. On the other side of the store, Claudia had seen the call. She hadn't heard it, but she had seen Diane's posture during the call. Her spine erect, her chin slightly raised, a calm that wasn't indifference. And for the first time since the beginning of it all, the manager didn't quite know what to think. The address Eduardo sent was for a small, discreet coffee shop, 3 blocks from the city center. It wasn't the kind of place someone of his level would choose for a business meeting. No meeting room, no assistant, no reserved table with a card. Just a table at the back, 2 coffees, and him in a simple shirt, no tie, with the same thin folder Diane had seen described in old company archive photos. He stood when she entered, shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for coming." Diane sat. She didn't say she had no choice. It wasn't quite true, and he probably knew it. Eduardo was 53, with graying hair at the temples and that specific look of someone who had built everything he had without inheriting anything. He wasn't the kind of man who impressed at first sight. He was the kind you underestimated once, and only once. He opened the folder. Diane's document was there with notes in the margins made in pencil. He had read it carefully. That already said something. "I'll be direct," he said. "This document describes problems my internal team identified over 2 years. I want to understand how you saw this in 3 weeks selling scarves. It wasn't a compliment, it was a question. Because I wasn't looking at the scarves, Diane replied. Eduardo remained silent, waited for more. I worked for 8 years in luxury brand consulting in Europe. She spoke unhurriedly, without trying to impress. I learned to read operations by what doesn't work. Customer flow, product positioning, real margin versus apparent margin. What's in the document is what any experienced analyst would see in 2 weeks of direct observation. Why were you observing? You were hired to sell. I was. But observing didn't prevent me from selling, and what I saw bothered me too much to ignore. Eduardo looked at her for a moment, then at the document. There's a part here. He pointed to a page about supply contracts. You say the conditions are below the European market by about 18%. How did you arrive at that number without access to the contracts? An estimate based on the list prices of suppliers I identified from internal tags. I might be off by 2 or 3 percentage points, but the direction is correct. He made a pencil note. Why didn't you send this directly to me from the beginning? Why wait 3 weeks? Diane considered the question carefully before answering, because data without context is noise. I needed enough time for the numbers to make sense on their own. And why? She paused for a second. I wasn't sure if you were the type of person who listens or the type who dismisses. Eduardo looked up from the paper. And do you know now? I'm still not certain. He almost smiled. Almost. You know my wife asked for your dismissal. It wasn't a question. I do, Diane said. And you still sent the document. Precisely because of that. Eduardo remained silent for a moment longer, looking at the page with the supply contracts. Diane said nothing, but both knew that if someone cross-referenced those numbers with the names behind the suppliers, a known name would appear in at least 2 of them. Eduardo closed the folder, crossed his arms on the table, and looked at her with a different kind of attention. Not the attention of someone evaluating a resume, but of someone trying to understand what they were truly seeing. What do you want? He asked directly. I want to work on a problem worth solving. She didn't hesitate. This company's European expansion has structural flaws that will cost dearly in the next 2 years if not corrected now. I know this market. I have contacts that took decades to build. And as you can see, I know how to identify what's wrong before it turns into a loss. You're offering me your services. I'm telling you what I can do. What you do with that is your decision. Silence. Eduardo looked out the window for a few seconds, then returned to her. There's a corporate event in 10 days. Investors, partners, some international clients. My wife will be there. A calculated pause. I also want you to be there. I'm not promising anything, he continued. I'll analyze the document with my financial team this week. If the numbers hold up, we'll talk again before the event. If they don't, it was a good conversation, and I'll pay for the coffee. It was fair. It was also an elegant way of saying, I still haven't decided. Diane nodded. All right. She stood up, picked up a bag. Eduardo also stood. One last thing, he said before she left. How did you know I would read it? She thought for an instant. I didn't know. I gambled you were curious enough to at least open it. She left the coffee shop into the morning light with her usual step, but something had changed. It wasn't relief yet. No. It was something closer to the feeling of having laid all her cards on the table and still not knowing what the hand on the other side held. The event was held in a 4-story hotel ballroom, with chandeliers that cost more than cars and a waiter service that moved without making a sound. Diane arrived punctually, in a simple, dark dress, unadorned. It wasn't the kind of outfit that draws attention. It was the kind that doesn't detract. She recognized some faces investors she had encountered years ago in very different contexts. European partners whose names had appeared in reports she herself had analyzed. No one recognized her. She counted on that. Eduardo greeted her briefly at the entrance with the same objectivity as in the coffee shop. He merely said the numbers had held up. He said nothing more. He indicated a table near the center of the ballroom and moved on. It was enough. Vera arrived 20 minutes later. She entered with the self-assurance of someone who knows every inch of that kind of space. Long dress, discreet but expensive jewelry, a smile calibrated for the occasion. She greeted investors by their first names. She embraced partners with the familiarity of someone who cultivates relationships with care and intention. When she saw Diane sitting at that table, she paused for a fraction of a second. Then she continued smiling, but the smile became 1 millimeter more strained. She approached Eduardo and spoke something low into his ear. He listened, nodded slightly, and didn't respond. Vera waited longer. He had already turned to greet someone else. Dinner was served. Conversations flowed. Diane observed, listened, participated when someone addressed her, and twice, European partners at the next table struck up a conversation in French. She responded naturally, with the technical vocabulary of someone who knew the industry from the inside. One of them jotted something down on his phone after the conversation. Vera was 3 tables ahead and saw everything. When dinner concluded, and the ballroom transitioned to the speeches, she took the floor first. It was the usual script: thanks, vision for the future, references to the company's international positioning. She spoke with fluency, with elegance, with that French she used as a trophy in such moments. The audience applauded. It was the polite applause of those who are well-fed and satisfied. Then, Eduardo stood up. Before concluding, he said with that calm voice that didn't need volume to fill a ballroom, "I would like to share something with you." Vera, still standing near the microphone, adjusted her smile. "In recent months, we identified significant flaws in our European expansion strategy, flaws that cost real opportunities and need to be corrected urgently." He paused. "You received a summary at your table. Please follow along." Another pause. What surprised me wasn't identifying the problems. It was discovering that they had already been mapped with precision and depth by someone who had been working in our store for less than a month. "Diane, could you please come up here?" She stood, walked to the center of the ballroom with her usual step, unhurriedly, without hesitation, without the weight of someone who needed to prove something. Vera didn't move, but her knuckles, resting on the nearest table, turned white for an instant. Diane stood beside Eduardo. He took a step to the side, not back, but to the side as if sharing the space, not ceding it. She opened the folder she had brought. "I will be brief," she said in clear, direct English. "There are 3 central problems in the European expansion that, if not corrected in the next 6 months, will represent market loss in 2 strategic regions." And she went on without a long introduction, without circumlocution data, comparisons, projections, each point supported by numbers that anyone in the room with financial experience could verify. She spoke in English, then repeated the central points in French for the international partners, without announcing she would do so. She just did. One of the European investors leaned forward in his chair. Vera tried once, raised her hand politely, and said, "With all due respect, these data were compiled by someone without formal access to the company's contracts. The margin of error could be significant." Diane turned to her with the same calm as when she had replied in French in the store. "The estimated margin is on page 3 of the document everyone has now received." She paused briefly. "But if there's interest in comparing with the formal contracts, I'd be happy to do so now." Silence. Vera didn't fully retreat. She tried a second time, differently, more socially, as if appealing to the audience. "The issue isn't just technical, it's about representation. How can someone without an executive link to the company speak on its behalf before international investors?" Diane let the question hang, then replied slowly, "That's exactly why the problems went unnoticed for 2 years. Those with an executive link weren't looking at the numbers, they were looking at the stage." The European investor who had jotted something on his phone during dinner leaned slightly to the side and said something low to his colleague. Both nodded. Vera slowly lowered her hand, looking at the table in front of her. Diane closed her folder. "That's all," she said simply. The applause that followed wasn't the polite applause of those satisfied after dinner. It was different. It was the kind of applause that happens when an entire room understands, at the same time, that something has just changed. After the event, the ballroom slowly emptied. Diane stood near the window with a glass of water in her hand while some guests said their goodbyes. 2 of the European partners came up to her, not out of protocol, but with that genuine curiosity of wanting to understand who they were speaking with. They talked for almost half an hour. One of them mentioned a conference in Lisbon in March. He said it would be interesting to have her there. She jotted down his contact. Vera left before the end, without saying goodbye to Diane, without making a scene. She left with the same elegant stride as always, her face composed, her smile in place. Only those who knew that smile well would know it was empty in a different way that night. In the days that followed, things changed in a silent way, which is how important things usually change. Eduardo formalized a proposal for Diane the following week. It wasn't the position she had asked for, because she hadn't asked for any. It was the position that made sense. Director of European Expansion with real autonomy to map, negotiate, and correct what was wrong. A compatible salary, a 90-day deadline to present a structured plan. She read the contract carefully, asked 2 questions about operational autonomy, received the answers, and signed. Claudia found out via corporate email, like all the other store employees. She stared at the screen for a long time, then closed her computer and went to attend to a client. Rodrigo, who had pretended not to hear so many things over those weeks, sent Diane a short message. "You deserved it. Good luck." She replied with a simple thanks and put her phone away. Vera, in turn, continued to exist in the same way she always had, with her surname, her lifestyle, her events, her greetings, and her calibrated smile. But something had permanently shifted. The investors who once sought her out to discuss her husband's business now sought Eduardo directly. European partners responded to her emails with cordiality, and to Diane's with urgency. There was no public confrontation, no declaration, no named and shamed punishment. There was something more enduring. She ceased to be necessary, and for someone whose entire identity was built on being indispensable, this was the kind of loss that no jewelry, no event, and no smile could hide forever. Diane started her new role on a Monday with the same worn backpack on her shoulder. The office was different, larger, with a view of the street, a real desk, and a chair that didn't wobble, but she arrived at the same time as always. She made coffee, opened her black-covered notebook, a new one, because the previous was full, and began to write. It wasn't victory she felt. It was something calmer than that. It was the kind of feeling that comes when a long and difficult thing finally reaches where it should. Not relief, not euphoria, just the clarity of being in the right place, doing the right thing. In her first meeting with the European team, one of the analysts asked where she had come from. Not with ill intent, but with genuine curiosity, because her profile didn't fit any of the boxes they expected. Diane thought for a second before replying, "I come from a place where I learned that competence doesn't need permission to exist, it only needs patience." No one laughed, no one found it strange. Two of the analysts jotted down the phrase. The meeting continued. Weeks later, during a call with a partner in Paris, the same one who had been mentioned as a possible threat to the company months earlier, Diane sealed an agreement that none of the contracted consultants had managed to close in 2 years. Not because she used tricks, not because she forced it, but because she knew the market, spoke the language, and understood what the other side needed to hear. Eduardo received the negotiation report on a Thursday afternoon. He read it, made a short note in the margin, in pencil, as was his custom. The note simply said, "As expected, Diane never knew this. She didn't need to." What she knew, and what time had confirmed silently and irrevocably, was that class is not about the language you speak, not about the surname you carry, the clothes you wear, or the salon where you are received with reverence. Class is about what you do when no one is looking, and about what you continue to be when everyone is. Diane closed the meeting, returned to her desk, opened her black-covered notebook, wrote Paris, meeting 0800. She closed the notebook. The small click of the metal clasp echoed in the silent room, and she left with the same worn backpack on her shoulder, with the same step as always, as if the whole world still didn't know who she was, and as if that, deep down, had never really mattered. In the end, it wasn't about French, it was about misjudgment. She thought she was superior. She was oblivious. Those who speak loudly are not always those who know most, and those who work quietly are almost always seeing further.